Welcome back, everybody. These are the horror films that scared everybody in the entire world of 1971. Let's check out the horror films that scared us, the best horror films of 1971. The Abominable Dr. Phibbs. Doctor, scientist, and organist, and biblical scholar seeks revenge on the 9 doctors he considers responsible for the death of his wife. Next up we have is Legacy of Blood, horror movie about 3 wicked sisters and their equally unsavory husbands who all arrive at a remote inn where one by one they die. Next up we have is Blood and Lace. Slasher. After her prostitute mother is murdered, a teenage girl is sent to a remote orphanage run by a mysterious woman and her handyman. Blood and Lace. Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. An archaeological expedition brings back to London the coffin of an Egyptian queen known for her magical powers. Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. Dracula vs. Frankenstein. Dracula conspires with a mad doctor to resurrect the Frankenstein monster. Dracula vs. Frankenstein will not disappoint. Horror movies are good in the 70s, aren't they? They're getting good. Godzilla vs. Hedorah. A toxic, ever-evolving alien life form from the dark, gaseous nebula arrives to consume rampant pollution. Godzilla vs. Hedorah. Los Campeones, The Justice. The Justice Champions. 5 wrestlers combat the evil villains. Again, you have Mexican wrestlers fighting evil monsters. The Champion Justice. Play Misty for Me. This movie is awesome. The life of a disc jockey is turned upside down after a romantic encounter with an obsessed fan. Clint Eastwood and Jessica Walter Evelyn were awesome. The Return of Count Yorga. Count Yorga continues to prey on the local community while living by a nearby orphanage. The Return of Count Yorga. Notice all these Dracula films? I love it. Santo in the Vengeance of the Mummy. Again, the Mexican wrestler battles a mummy. When Mexican wrestler and superhero Santo and his crew disturb the long-lost tomb of a mummified Aztec mummy, he comes to life. Santo versus the Vice Mafia. Santo confronts the mafia and monsters. Look at that. I love it. More Mexican wrestling horror films. I have all these horror films. I love it. Willard. A social misfit uses his only friends, his pet rats, to exact revenge on his tormentors. Willard. Next up we have is A Bay of Blood. The murder of a wealthy countess triggers a chain reaction of brutal killings in the surrounding Bay Area. A Bay of Blood. Beast of Blood. A mad scientist creates a monster, but after its head is cut off, he keeps it alive in a serum he has invented. Beast of Blood will not disappoint. Beast of the Yellow Knight. Satan saves a man from death on condition he becomes his disciple. Beast of the Yellow Knight is scary and spooky. Black Belly of the Tarantula. A series of victims are paralyzed while having their bellies ripped open, much in the same way tarantulas are killed by the black wasp. Black Belly of the Tarantula. Blood Shack. A young woman inherits a ranch that is supposedly haunted by a murderous beast called the Trooper. Blood Shack will not disappoint. Brain of Blood. Amir, the benevolent ruler of Khalid, is dying, but there is a hope. Freshly deceased, he comes back to life and kills. Brain of Blood. Countess Dracula. In 17th century Hungary, elderly widow Countess Elizabeth maintains her misleading youthful appearance by bathing in blood. Countess Dracula. Crucible of Terror. An obsessed sculptor kills a young woman to make a perfect bronze sculpture of her. Crucible of Terror will not disappoint. Next up we have is the horror film Devil's Nightmare. A group of tourists traveling on a bus take a detour to stay overnight in a castle owned by a family cursed by Satan. Devil's Nightmare. Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde. A Victorian scientist tests a serum that transforms him into a sensuous murderess. Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde. Again, we have Dracula versus Frankenstein. Dracula conspires with a mad doctor to resurrect the Frankenstein monster. This movie is so good I had to include it again. Check it out if you can. Two monsters battling it out. Duel. A business commuter is pursued and terrorized by the malevolent driver of a massive tractor trailer. Duel. This movie is awesome with Dennis Weaver and a killer truck. Guess what happened to Count Dracula? Count Dracula changes his name to Count Adrian and opens a strange nightclub called Dracula's Dungeon. Guess what happened to Count Dracula? Hands of the Ripper. As a young child, Jack the Ripper's daughter witnesses him kill her mother. Hands of the Ripper. This movie is eerie and spooky and chilling. Next up we have is In the Devil's Garden. After one schoolgirl is raped while taking a shortcut through the local woods, another is murdered. In the Devil's Garden. This is horror and chilling and spine-tingling. Isle of the Snake People. An evil scientist runs a veritable army of LSD-crazed zombies. Isle of the Snake People will not disappoint. Next up we have is Lady Frankenstein. Baron Frankenstein's daughter and his assistant, her lover, continue his experiments in an attempt to rebuild his legacy after he is killed by a psychotic murderous first monster. Lake of Dracula. A doctor investigates the murders of several women at a lakeside resort. Murders in the Rue Morgue. Paris. At the turn of the century, Inspector Vidocq investigates a series of unexplained murders. Murders in the Rue Morgue. This is spine-tingling mystery and romance. Horror. Next up we have is Night of Dark Shadows. A painter and his wife move into a home and find themselves plagued by ghosts and spirits of his ancestors that used to be witches. Octoman. A team of researchers discovers a strange mutation of man and octopus who proceeds to terrorize them. Octoman. Horror sci-fi. Next up we have is The Incredible Two-Headed Transplant. Dr. Roger Gerard, a mad scientist who dares to combine two heads onto one body despite serious consequences. The Incredible Two-Headed Transplant. Something creeping in the dark. A group of stranded travelers take refuge in an old abandoned house, only to find out that they are not only the residents of the building. Something creeping in the dark. Mickey Rooney stars as the Manipulator. An insane Hollywood makeup man kidnaps a woman, keeps her prisoner in his warehouse full of props. The Manipulator. Thriller and horror. The Night Visitor. In a Scandinavian insane asylum, murderer Salem sneaks out at night to exact his revenge on those he deems responsible for his predicament. The Night Visitor. The Corpse Grinders. When the Lotus Cat Food Company finds itself in financial trouble, the owners decide to find a new, cheap source of meat, the local graveyard. The Corpse Grinders. Ugh. Ugh. The House That Dripped Blood. An anthology of 4 horror stories revolving around a mysterious rental house in the UK. The House That Dripped Blood. Next thing we have is The Nightcomers, prequel to Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, focusing on groundskeeper Peter Quint's slow corruption of the virtuous governess Miss Jessel. The Nightcomers. Lastly, we have is The Vampire Happening, an American actress inherits a castle in Transylvania. What she doesn't know is that her ancestor, the Baroness, was in actuality a vampire countess. The Vampire Happening. Those were the horror films that scared everyone, including me, back in 1971. If there's any horror films that came out in 1971 that you remember that perhaps I didn't cover here, let me know in the comments below. What do you think about these movies? Did you remember any of these movies? Because now we're getting into a lot of Dracula movies. Since 1970, we got a ton of Dracula movies coming out, most notably with Christopher Lee. And we have a plethora of horror movies coming out of Mexico with El Santo, the Mexican wrestler in white mask, and Blue Demon, another famous Mexican wrestler, always battling monsters and zombies and creatures and mafias. So far 70 and 71 were great years for horror films. Stick around, we're on to 1972. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all in the next video.